Welcome to another artist conversation in our series, Pathways for Dialogue, Past, Present, Future.
So, needless to say, I like to keep it light and conversational, but it is really exciting to be here with two artists I consider brothers, and we're always in dialogue. So being invited by both of them was really special. So thank you both for allowing me to do this with you. Just quick introductions, right? Yashua is born in Chicago, Illinois, and studied fine art at Northern Illinois University in DeKalb, and received his MFA from Hunter College. In his wood and woodblock print-based multimedia practice, Yashua explores themes of identity, memory, and African-American relationship to American labor. His work reimagines the Black body as an alchemical being surviving and existing within intertwined networks of history, myth, and lived reality. Paul Anthony Smith is from a very special place in Jamaica, West Indies, not Jamaica, Queens, and studied fine art at the Kansas City Art Institute. Paul creates paintings and picotage on pigment prints that explore the artist's autobiography, as well as issues of identity within the African diaspora, referencing both W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of double consciousness and Frantz Fanon's theory of diasporic cultural confusions caused by colonialism. Smith's practice celebrates this rich complexity and the histories of post-colonial Caribbean and its people. Welcome. So, Pathways for Dialogue. I think one of the interesting things about this titling of this week has been thinking about generative conversations. And one of the things that I love about you guys, if I see one, I see all five of you. In my mind, you all have such a rich community. And I just wanted to sort of ground the conversation in your relationship. How did you meet? You both live in New York, both have studios in the Bronx. We just want some, bird's eye view.
I'm gonna pass this to Paul because Paul actually knows the day that we met, and I know more about kind of, I guess, how the friendship evolved. Because you told me just minutes ago about the day we met.
So we met at Derek Forgeau's opening at Tenike.
Right.
One of his first earliest exhibitions. And I think he introduced us because I didn't know who Derek was. I never met Derek before. And I walked in and he's like, Paul Anthony Smith. I was like, who is this guy? I don't know him. And then
that sounds right.
We all became close-knit ever since. And I think, there's various others that has fallen in that
tribe.
Yeah, I think we just hit it off. Like, I remember making a conscious decision. I made a New Year's resolution that year, and I never made one, but I thought to myself, I want to start being surrounded by inspired people, regardless of what they did, made, or what their profession was. And Paul was clearly someone who was so committed to the arts, and he knows that I'm a fan of his work, but he's also just sort of a constant student of the arts. So I always felt like being around Paul, I was also around somebody that was constantly looking and challenging themselves. So that was something that I admired about you.
I'm surprised. I'm absolutely surprised. Didn't expect you to say that, but thank you.
Of course.
So are you in each other's studio often? How does the exchange happen? Or is it more sort of on a personal level? Are you talking about work, material, and process? Or is it just hey bro, what are you eating for lunch? What does that look like?
I've thought about Yashua a whole lot the past few weeks because of the NBA playoffs, because Zach, myself, and Yashua would meet up and watch a few playoff games during the season. But
Zach Fabry, who just walked in. I try to reach out more recently because we've changed locations.
we used to be walking distance in Brooklyn when our studios were close by, and now it's not so close, and our lives have changed. And like when I walked in there this earlier, I said, I think about you every morning, because we also used to meet up at the gym. 9 o'clock, we have a routine. We'll go through it, we talk shop, cycle through that, and then.
Let me say also, this is another thing that's very rare about an artist, to be able to have an artist friend that sticks to a schedule. It's so rare, so I think that's another reason, another point where Paul and I connected, was because we would do these morning gym workouts. And yeah, he's one of the few artists I think who would commit to something like that. So.
Right, I know this feels like a strange conversation for an artist talk, but I think what people sort of miss when we're in the moment is living history, right? So when we think about whether it's writers or artists who are all in dialogue and conversation, and we look back on those historical moments, we tend to fantasize around that it was always this very serious engagement, and it could be just a cocktail or a workout or a basketball game, but that community in terms of shaping a narrative, and beginning that sort of conversation around the what's next. I think we're in a very interesting moment in terms of the diaspora where, yes, there is trauma that we're all unpacking, but also there is this generative conversation. Right, and I think that this kind of just natural living is an important part of the making, right? It's an important part of the process. So usually I'd like to ask people their origin stories, but we won't go there. I want to talk a little bit about your material origin stories. When you think about each of your work, there's a very process-laden practice, craft-based practices, and I'm just curious, like, where did you start? I mean, Paul, I know a little bit more in terms of the clay, and I won't go into the details about where that started, but can we talk a little bit about where you both started in terms of your practices?
Yeah, sure. So I I started doing printmaking, woodblock printing specifically when I got to grad school. And the teacher who introduced me to it, Dennis McNett, it was kind of just spectacular. He would give us these 8-foot by 4-foot blocks of MDF wood, and I had never worked that large. I'd never seen a wood block carved or printed that large. We would carve these blocks, and then as a class, we would sort of have a block party at the end of the semester. We would ink up each other's blocks, and he would hire a steamroller to drive over the blocks in order to create the pressure to print them. So that was like all kind of spectacular for me, and I was really attracted to the community of it, but also just how direct the mark making was, and then just sort of how large and monumental the works were that came from that. So that was my introduction to it, and from there, because I don't have my own steamroller, I had to figure out how to print by hand. So that really transformed the process, because I was printing with a wooden kitchen spoon, same scale, same size, 8-foot by 4-foot blocks, but finding a way to just really have ownership, I guess, of the printing process. And then from there it has evolved, and I've done all kinds of things to tweak the process, and of course, collage, and has evolved out of that.
We want to get into that. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the wood. Is there something about the wood that speaks to you? Because I think about wood, and I think about its earnestness. I think about the Midwest, its humility. I think about who you are as a person, the person that I know. Is there something about the wood that you're connected to?
Yeah, so there is, and I think also that connection has evolved as well through the process and the work. But initially, I was really excited about how direct the woodcut line turns into a graphic line when it was printed, and it kind of records this kinetic activity and this physicality of the maker, and maybe that is some Midwest like work ethic that's about going to work and carving, and then being able to see like the results of your labor. So for me, that was like the initial attraction. But then, of course, my work, a lot of the figures and the forms in the work are also sort of proposing that they're made out of building materials like wood or bricks. So that's a conversation that's really about wood as a material for construction. A lot of my family is in construction and building, and that relationship to like how we construct identities based on materials and resources in our environment.
Indeed. Speaking about environment, you know, Paul and I have had a lot of conversations. We both have a relationship to a very small and special place. And we were having a conversation in your studio a couple of years ago, I think, about your relationship to clay and how things started in terms of, you know, you started with a ceramic practice. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. You know, for me, it's, as you're saying, it goes way back to the 3rd grade where, first off, I had a large family, lots of aunts and uncles, and they all had various occupation of their own descriptions. But my aunt sold soup for a living, and oftentimes I would see like she would clean the pots and then you would use like the flour to like patch the holes in the pots. And so for me, that was kind of like very interesting to like look at how she would mold the flour around the handles of the pots. Or, you know, I would take some flour and burn it in the fire and like I would play with it, eat it. You know, I was very interested in the aspects of cooking. And so around that same time, I discovered clay in a river. On my way home from school, I was swimming in the river, found some clay. I first slipped on the riverbank. I took some clay home.
As one does. That's part of the
process. It was kind of like, oh my gosh, this is clay. I took that home, made some stick figures. By the time I immigrated to the United States in Miami, I remember going to school and, you know, having like refined clay in the classroom and being able to make various sculptures. Fast forward probably 10 years, I'm in college. I went to college initially to study painting. And while there, I saw these kilns. And I was like, oh my gosh, these kilns are massive, right? I could stand up in the kiln 6 feet perfectly fine. And so because of that, I decided to study ceramics because I felt like I was able to cook in these large kilns. And it was like me thinking about home and connecting the dots, you know? And even when I was in the studio making ceramic objects, I would be painting at home because I still wanted to paint. I still had a desire to continue painting and discovering. And as Yashua said, I'm a student of the world. You know, I try to expand on all aspects of the arts, the visual arts. And I think after, you know, I had a ceramic residency in Colorado in 2012, I began using my ceramic tool on a few photographs that I was printing. And from there, it turned into what is now coined as picotage. It's these surface collaging on the surface of these photographic prints that I produce. And it's gotten very developed in the way that I'm always refining the textures and the mark making. And even on those, I still paint.
I think it's fascinating with thinking about the picotage. It's only recently when we were talking, I found out that was a ceramic tool as a, you know, neophyte, you know, coming into that and seeing how that love and evolution has entered into a sort of a technical aspect of your practice, right? And I think when I was thinking about you both, there are a couple things that are synergies, right? The idea of taking the medium or the process forward and making it your own. So picotage is a process that you've developed, and I'm sure that people will study it and try it and, you know, all of those things. And I think that's very exciting. But even with Yashua, you know what I'm saying? When we were talking about the different types of tools, you were talking about the spoon. So can we go further into that, like in terms of, I know you don't make paper necessarily, but you have very unique printmaking processes. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, The spoon is funny because like people come in my studio, and obviously it's these like large works. I work pretty big, and then I hold up the kitchen spoon, which costs $1, the dollar store. I'm like, this is the heart behind the printmaking process for me. You know, I think I've always been, in terms of just like materials and supplies, I've always been attracted to easily accessible materials, things that I may not even have to go to an art supply store for, things that I can source locally from a dollar store or a grocery store. I'm always more interested in those kind of tools because for me, that's kind of about the art process as a democratic process that allows so many entry points for everybody. And that's also the attraction of printmaking, right? Because especially in America, the African-American tradition, Charles White, Elizabeth Catlett, they're making large edition prints because they believed that the prints were for the people. This was a way of creating images inexpensively to have a large output and distribute them as flyers or posters. So I've always been really excited about the accessibility of woodblock printing. And again, like for me, the graphic quality of it just really, it embodies all of that kind of direct to the people attitude, you know, and it has a sort of a propaganda feel.
Interesting. I think the other thing that connects you both is a commitment to labor. You both have very labor-intensive practices. And Paul, I'm curious about how you went from ceramic to, you know, sort of photographic prints. Like, what was that catalyst in that jump?
You know, I think it's very much looking at the way of being an immigrant and thinking of how this process of disguising the individual skin or picking away at the skin is a way to, like, you know, navigate society and become one as one people. I don't know if that makes sense to you guys, but it's sort of like becoming this chameleon and becoming part of the American landscape and thinking of how to camouflage myself within that scope of people. But also, it's very addictive to pick at these images because, you know, once I pick into these images, I'm not able to reverse it. And so I'm trying to pick new patterns and angles and get them perfectly correct. But it's a very obsessive and compulsive gesture, you know, and like, when I get home in the evening.
By the way, can I just say real quick? I have been trying to get Paul to get assistance because I want him to keep his wrist and his hand going for his entire career, but he won't do it.
It will never happen.
Yeah. It's
also, these images are somewhat personal, and you know, you can't really have someone else pick at the images, you know.
I know, Paul.
So there's something about them that I find interesting, and I have lots of images. And so it's kind of like cycling through them. And this is where Yashua comes in. I think of him, you know, telling me, you need assistance. You got to get assistance. But for me, it's about having the freedom to where the work could change on my terms and not having it, you know, being mass-produced. I'm not saying that if you have assistance. I'm just saying.
I just want you to keep that hand healthy forever. That's it. 1
month on, 1 month off, you know. I balance it out. I also paint, so right. I make it work.
You make it work.
Make it work.
It's so, I'm laughing because, yeah, you know, there's some other people that we know who have been practicing for about 40 years and still don't know or don't want to have assistance. And I think that's sort of it's a very personal thing. But speaking of personal, one of the things I also was thinking about when I'm looking at your work and thinking about the relationship and the intimacy in terms of, like, Yashua, we had a conversation with Sycamore Jenkins about our labor and this unveiling process of you finding family in Detroit and then having this sort of expansive practice, like, you know, amplifying them, right? And then really sort of bringing them forward in terms, so basically our labor Yashua made a monumental, I don't know if you've seen this, but a monumental mural-sized work referencing Diego Rivera's mural for GM, right?
Ford Motors.
Ford
yeah.
Motors, sorry. And it was all of his family members, you know, and thinking about that in relation to Paul, who also is engaging not only our people as Caribbean people, but also family members, friends from this very special place that we will not name, but protecting them, right? So can you guys talk a little bit about that approach? Because you have one person who's like, here's this person, I'm giving them to you in the most monumental scale possible so that they can be seen and acknowledged. And then you have another person who's also passionately in love with the people in his life who are like, I'm going to protect you by creating this scrim. It's beautiful, laborious scrim over you. So can you guys speak to that a little bit?
No, it's interesting. I think, like, for me, that also goes back to the commitment of carving the woodblock. So, as you mentioned, when I reconnected with my father's side of the family, the art became a way to connect to them, and then making portraiture became a way to study their faces and also have a reason to reach out to them and like stalk them and bother them for photos. So all of that that was sort of about like bridging the estrangement and finding the familiarity. Looking at their faces, finding how we're the same and also how we're different, and then standing over the block and carving that image was sort of a way to concretize that relationship. So I mean, from that, the other works evolved, which, to your point, were about taking up space. They were about representation, taking away. For the Diego Rivera depiction of the Ford workers, 1933, he had all white male workers in the auto plant, and replacing that with portraits of my family members. So that was, of course, about representation and a more full telling of that history and that story. So yeah, I mean, for me, representation is probably like key to my concerns in the image making and portraiture.
Mm-hmm. And I remember we talked about you saying that going through that process also creates these links for you. It memorializes it in terms of, like, you said concretize,
yeah,
but also the contours of their face and their
yeah.
skin
Yeah.
In that process, which I think is, sort of rebuilding what was lost in that time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of that work was for me, meaning that, even that mural and the way that the family members are laid out in the composition was a way for me to remember the family tree. So there was no key that I presented along with it. There was no instruction guide for a viewer on how to also see those relationships, because that was something that I needed to get from the mural. It's not necessarily something you would notice if you didn't know, but I could see in the composition the way that the figures are standing in certain groups that represented different parts of the family. And that was about me, learning my own family history.
Right. I think it's also, I'm thinking about both of the works, and I'm thinking about the fact that before I actually saw your work in person, I thought it was this three-dimensional thing, and that effect when you take a picture of his work, how it just sort of comes out at you. And it's funny because, Paul, you were just saying, like, the whole idea is to recede and to flatten into this kind of matrix and milieu. But can you talk a little bit about, and give everyone some context, because if you're not Caribbean, I think understanding the fact that we're a highly consumable culture. And people are always projecting whatever, sort of constructed ideas of what it means to be Caribbean onto you. We're here to be enjoyed and played with, and, we're entertainment. So can you talk a little bit about the process of sort of creating that protection and obscuring?
Yeah, I think, I think it started after I became an American citizen, and I went back to Jamaica after receiving my passport for about the first few weeks. I went to Jamaica and I wrote that I'm Jamaican and I had this US passport. I remember the immigration officer crossing it out, and I felt like my identity was removed, and I think that's what plays into a lot of these works. It's about customs, clearance, and how, these images, when you take a photograph, you're trying to elevate an image or reveal information. And for me, when I take these images, I think about them as memory and how the memory function is. I also use film, so I forget what's on the roll until I get the images back, and then it's like, oh, magic. Didn't expect these, but that's what's there. But even though that I have these images that I now get to work with, I'm still trying to push them back a bit more to where I'm not ready for the viewer to fully understand them, because there's a lot of nuances about that moment that I took those images, right? They're all personal. I might make them public, but for me, they're very personal. And sometimes I'll go in Photoshop to change things around because I want you to get a different sense of the atmosphere. And the labor that I put into these images, get me to look things up about home, or reach out to someone to check in on the person that I'm picking out their face while I'm working on them. And it's always strange, but sometimes these individuals don't know about these works. And most of them don't know about these works. I don't show them what I've done to these works, but for me, it's more so I think at the same time that I'm picking at these images, I'm retaining a lot of that information about that time, rather than a fleeting moment where I take an image and then it's gone. So I'm spending time with these people or landscapes and these, just the narrative of home that is a very special place. And I think even though they're very labor intensive, I'm sort of recharging from seeing these images and working on them. It's complicated.
Right.
It's complicated. We talk about these things of what it's like.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is the idea of reinforcing memory. You both have spoken to that, and as you were talking, also the idea of the brick, the architecture of the space, because you had mentioned the block and you have breeze block, and I'm also I think we move through the world without realizing the affect of the architecture, the violence of the architecture that sort of we're engaged in, because one of the things I always say, it's you can't really be free until you can imagine in 3 dimensions, and the fact that we're in someone else's imagination is really interesting, and the fact that you're both subtly engaging the architecture.
It's the foundation.
Yeah. The other thing that also is connecting you both is the idea of, Paul, I see a liminal space, right? You talk about memory, but there's also, you covered a 9-night, which is a very private spiritual practice that happens, sort of in the mountains. And then I look at your work, Yashua, and I see this sort of celestial engagement. You have crystals, you have things that are also happening, that are charging, right? So I know you guys didn't think I would go there. That was not on my list, but since we're here, let's go. So can we talk about sort of the deeper aspects of the work that are not, we've talked about the familial, right? Yeah. We've talked about maybe a little bit of the social, in terms of the architecture, but can we talk about that kind of, dare I say, spirit space or other aspects of the work?
Yeah, I mean, for me, you mentioned the crystals are sort of celestial, or there's sometimes references to the cosmos. And for me, that's kind of about the idea of depicting a blackness that isn't defined by earthly constructs, right? Or anything that is familiar to us through colonized identity. This is about a an expansive identity that exists beyond all the limitations and pressures and expectations that we understand here. I think some of that is, I don't talk about my work in the same vein of Afrofuturism, but I do understand that, Sun Ra is also kind of excited about that idea. But that's really, for me, what I'm thinking of is how can we start to define ourselves out of beyond anything that we've understood thus far. Yeah. Some mystical relationships.
I'm going to hold that.
Okay.
I had that follow. I was like, I'm going to hold that question. But Paul, can we talk a little bit about those references in your work? Different but similar?
They're different but very similar in the sense that, whenever I think about life, I always think about death. Like when my son was born, I thought about everyone who was buried underneath a tree. I was like, oh my gosh, if they could see you right now, they'd be laughing. And it's, there's a lot of spirituality that goes into the work based on things that I've encountered that I don't really speak very much about, but I just try to put it in the visual presence of what's happening in these scenes that I'm composing. And in those 9 nights, it's a gathering to celebrate the life of the individual who's passed on.
Can we talk a little bit more about what a 9 night is? I just want to make sure everyone's on the same.
A 9 night is from what I've understand and experienced and I've cooked at, is a dead yard to celebrate. It's what the ninth night of ascension. Of
the ascension.
The
after
ascension.
someone said.
For me, it's sort of like the Last Supper, but in a very different way. And it's kind of like the send-off ceremony before the funeral at the church, this place of worship. And it's where everyone come together, drink, eat, celebrate your life, and give you, it's like your last party send-off. And in some ways, I always feel like there's extra spirits and energies around where I've seen somebody's foot get ran over by a car, and at one of these 9 nights, and he just kept walking like nothing happened. I mean, his whole ankle, I thought it was crushed. I was a little kid. I remember it very vividly. It was probably I was up in, anyways. And I saw that, and I was just like, yo, this is really happening? I can't believe he just walked like nothing. And I was like, it's not just the white rum, it has to be something else. And so I'm just like,
There's
okay.
a lot of rum involved.
There's a lot of rum. It's like,
For good reason, it sounds like.
For good reason, and it's like someone will drink a whole bottle of rum by themselves, and you can't.
Jamaican rum is overproof, so it's not like it's like poison.
It's like gasoline. And
white rum.
In these moments, you drink, you party, you eat, you wake up the next morning, you go and bury that person, and it's like, at the 9 night, everyone's celebrating, music's playing, everyone's dancing, and then at the funeral, tears come out, because this is when the body comes out. You've seen the person going down the grave, and it's kind of like it's really happening. And it's kind of like you see it, we've all been to a funeral. I've been to many. And I feel like, even this morning I took a picture on my phone of one of these individuals in the studio. And I'm like, I can't believe you're not here, but I keep your image so I could think about you every day. It's kind of like an altar in the studio. And I think that energy of that person is still with me when I'm walking. And even in these 9 nights, there's many personas and energies around. That's how I feel from where I'm from, and I try to put that in various aspects of the works that I produce. And it's just the balance of life.
I think it's also, as you're talking, I was watching a documentary on sort of New Orleans and sort of their carnival culture and the sort of celebratory nature of death. And I think during the pandemic, we all got really close, to death in a different way. And I think, especially here in the States, where we have this kind of Disney World-esque culture where everything is great and wonderful and, no one's ever going to die, we're going to live forever, I think other cultures engage that sort of duality of life and death and, build and destroy, dare I say, more elegantly. It just is, right? So it was really wonderful to, I feel like even during the pandemic for myself, like I had to grow to engage that conversation more deeply, because I tend to lean towards the celestial and the light and the fairy, you know what I'm saying? So it was interesting to see that body of work at the gallery. And I'll tell you guys a quick story. So the first time I saw Paul's work, I had not known about Paul nor met him. Walked into Jack Shaman Gallery, and I saw the work, and I started hyperventilating. And I was like, whose work is this? Why are they showing home? Why are they offering this special place to the art world? I had a moment, you know, and one of the directors in the gallery had to like, okay, calm down. He's actually Jamaican. This is why there's this picotage. But I felt like something that was special was being given away, you know, in a weird way. And then getting to know you and understanding what you were doing, obviously that has receded, but rightfully so. I'm happy that you obscure it because it feels like the portraits are very intimate and it cannot be consumed. He has a picture of a family member that's on a tree on a beach. And as soon as I saw the tree on the beach, I knew exactly the beach and the tree. And I was like, oh my goodness. You know, so I think that's really interesting, the way that you both engage memory, reinforce it, as well as sort of offer it and bring it forward. So with that, speaking of forward, so let's go forward. Future, you know, I can honestly say I'm a futurist. I'm interested in imagination. I think imagination is really important. What are you thinking about in terms of the future? Like in the studio now, you're present, you're working. What are you working towards?
I'm just hoping that it rains one of these days. You know, I've been looking forward to the rain. I wake up and check the weather, and that's, you know.
You see why this is my friend? This is why I love this guy.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
I like that answer too much.
No, guys, you're not going to do that to me.
So, I mean, I've been thinking about kind of this idea of future. I've been thinking about an alternative present, which is sort of a kind of future because in order to have an alternative present, you have to assume a host of things in a timeline that haven't happened, right? In order to arrive at sort of a new reality. So there's a sort of like predicting that you're extrapolating from like, you know, some given history, but then adding your own history. So actually, I think I mentioned this, Tiana, when we talked at Sycamore, my show, but I'm thinking about an alternative present space for the auto industry where there no collapse, and if there wasn't, you know, the greed of capitalism that shipped most of those jobs overseas, and if a city like Detroit had maintained the heart of the American economy, what that would mean for black folks in Detroit, moving from roles of worker status to ownership in a place like the Ford auto plant. So a completely vertically integrated economy run and owned by black folks in Detroit. I think that is like a very interesting reality that I'm starting to consider in different ways in the studio.
Right, and
I've already said too much, so I'm not going to say.
Right,
much
no.
more
We
about
don't.
that,
We don't
but-
want you to give it all away.
Yeah.
But I think that, you know, not necessarily our current audience, but if there are people who are able to watch and listen to this conversation, who are not necessarily part of the art world or practicing artists or curators, I think understanding that artists are thinking about problems and solving problems in real time And that's where the power of the work lies. It's really important to, we talk about all kinds of things, whether we're deconstructing time or reading about physics or like all these things are happening, but people see, pretty pictures, so there's so much more.
It takes work to get to the pretty picture, right?
Yeah. Right, exactly. So I think sometimes it's really important to give people a little peek into what might be going on. We're avid, voracious readers. So Paul, will you give us a little something like, can you, or even like, what are you reading now? What are you into now? Like, what's happening?
Oh man, that's a tough
You don't have to give
question.
all. I know there's 7 books, so
All
just give us
raising a baby
one.
right now.
I know
that's kind of where
you know what? I spaced on that. You don't have time.
I don't have time. Exactly, I don't have
I
time.
don't have time.
Yeah, I think right now I'm really trying to find more time to do a lot of things that I haven't really been able to do in the past 2 or 3 years. I think COVID forced me to somewhat grow up to where I began to think about life in a bit more foundational, I don't know if that's clear for you guys, but I'm trying to really think about my future and care for those around me at home a bit more. And try to think about what I really want to do with them and how to grow that to the next place. Like I'm thinking about land. Like recently I found myself trying to search online where all the walnut and oak trees grow in eastern Pennsylvania, western Jersey, right? And looking for acreage of this sort of all these trees that I could harvest the wood on my own property, right? Just little thoughts out there so I could also have a kiln and get back to ceramics and make work.
Right, that three-dimensional
Three-dimensional works, yeah.
Yeah, imagination, space.
Yeah.
But that's a big deal, and that's a valid thought that I think a lot of people are thinking about. I discovered maple water this March, and it was transformative. I'm like, okay, harvesting maple water. Do you know that maple trees give you fresh water? Like it's a thing. Japanese know about it. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, long story short is, thank you for sharing that, because I know it's really difficult to share what you're thinking about in real time as you're generating ideas and as it's melding into the work. But with that in mind, I do want to turn it over to the audience in case we have 1 or 2 questions. Do we have some time for that? Yeah. Don't be shy. Don't be shy.
So we talked a bit about, what it is that you want to do in the future, but I'm also really curious, as 2 artists who have been able to work in really large and difficult media, you've been able to realize complicated projects that others don't necessarily have access to. What's something that you have wanted to do in the past but haven't yet realized?
You want to take that one?
I'll let you go for it. Let me get some more time.
Ideas that I've had that I haven't yet realized. I mentioned this before, Tiana, last time we talked, that I have some film project ideas that are based around that alternative present that I mentioned. So I'm thinking about how to kind of scaffold a project that doesn't arrive as, say, a feature film, but there's short videos that sort of give some slice of life narrative of this alternative world that I'm thinking of, and then the idea is that will eventually end up into longer form film.
I think it goes back to the futures question, is that, I've always had this desire to get back to ceramics and sculptural elements, and I think that's where I'm really trying to aim in the next few years is, get back to clay when clay is no longer cool.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I didn't know you wanted to go back in that direction.
Thank you both.
I think
for
we
sharing.
answered everything, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming.
And thank you all for coming. I want to stress, first of all, that we have a party on Saturday, where Claudia will hit me, from 4 to 8 here, which was originally going to be a closing party, but because we have happily extended until June 10th, so we'll have 4 or 5 more public programs, it's going to be a celebration of the extension. So we really hope you all come. 4 to 8, wine, more potato chips. No, it's going to be catered. It's going to be catered. Such a fantastic conversation. Can't thank you all enough. Really, really fun and interesting and full of more questions for people sitting here listening to you, I think, and looking forward to more of your work. So one more hand for our beautiful panel here. Thank you.